Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have a tremendously exciting announcement to make. Yes, Roger and I decided to be just like every other booktube channel in the world and have our own book club, which we are announcing today. We are announcing Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Yes, it is a book club very much in the spirit of this channel, in that it's full of really old books. Now, I am aware that Steve Donahue on his channel has just kind of announced something really similar. But you know, we're not ripping off his idea or anything. We came up with it independently at around the same time. Honest. So, this is our own book club, Roger's and mine. We put our heads together to think about the books that we are going to be reading in this book club, and they are all really old, and most importantly, none of them will cost you a cent if you want to join us, because they are all in the public domain. Every single book that we will be reading in our book club, every single book is available for free at Project Gutenberg if you wish to download it for free. So there you go. They are really cheap. It should be Roger's free old book club, but it's Roger's cheap old book club, you know. So yeah, our book club, which starts next month in February, we already put together a list of every single book that we're going to be reading for our book club this year. That way, you can decide if you want to join us, if you see anything interesting. You can decide if you just want to join us once in a while, or if you just want to ignore us altogether, which is perfectly understandable. So, the first book, February's book, is the book that actually got me thinking about doing this in the first place, and that is The Prisoner of Zenda. The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. The Prisoner of Zenda, a very influential book. This inspired a lot of books in the vein of Prisoner of Zenda, The Prisoner of Zenda by Anthony Hope. And this is a classic adventure novel. However, it's kind of been forgotten in a way. Not too many people read this, it seems like. There are some reprint houses that don't even publish this anymore. I don't think Penguin has a current edition of this. I don't know that Oxford does. It might, but I don't think so. So it's one of those books, you know, that at least at one time was considered a classic, but not many people read it anymore, which is a shame. I read this in my 20s. It was a while ago, and I remember it being pretty good. So yeah, The Prisoner of Zenda, our February pick for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. I hope you join us for this book. We will be having a special discussion about this book at the end of February. I know all of you have many things to read. But, you know, it's free. So there you go. And in March, the book club continues with The Forgotten Planet by Murray Leinster. Murray Leinster, who Leinster was at one time a fairly well-known science fiction writer. And he wrote a lot else besides. He wrote a lot in the pulps. He wrote a lot of paperback originals. And at one time, if you read science fiction, you knew who this guy was. But he's sort of been forgotten. So forgotten that his work, a lot of it anyway, has been allowed to lapse and go into the public domain. The copyright was not renewed on a lot of his stuff. So, and he's not considered a top-tier classic science fiction writer like Asimov and Heinlein and all those guys. So, yeah, he's kind of been forgotten, but he's a lot of fun. He's a pretty good writer, Leinster is. He at one time was known as the dean of science fiction, at least according to some cover blurbs. He wrote a lot for Astounding Science Fiction magazine, for example, and magazines like that. And this was one of his more popular stories. This is The Forgotten Planet, which I did read a number of years ago. It's been a long time. I remember it being good, but to tell you the honest truth, I don't remember too much about it. So it's going to be fun to read it once again, you know, as an old person now as opposed to a young person. So yeah, The Forgotten Planet, our March pick, which brings us to April, when we will be reading New Arabian Nights by Robert Louis Stevenson. So this is a Robert Louis Stevenson book that not too many people read. All of these stories, this is a book of short stories, and a lot of them, of course, have been reprinted. If you've read, for example, the complete stories of Robert Louis Stevenson, there are a few different editions of that, then you've read these. But there's a good chance that you haven't read that, and there's a very good chance that you haven't read this particular book. In fact, I don't think I've read these stories in this particular book. So it'll be fun. This was an early book by Robert Louis Stevenson, some of his short stories. It's actually considered quite a good book. So there you go. That is April, which brings us to May. May. With The Three Impostors by Arthur Machen. Classic horror writer Arthur Machen. The Three Impostors is a classic horror novel that not many people read anymore. There is an edition of this that's available from Oxford in their Arthur Machen collection. This is an episodic novel that has sort of been cut apart, and different parts of it have been published as separate short stories over the years. But it's not too often that you hear it talked about as a whole novel as it was originally intended. So this should be a fun one to read. Arthur Machen is tremendously important as far as horror, the horror genre is concerned. His work had a great influence on H.P. Lovecraft and many other horror writers. This is a book that if you're interested in that kind of stuff, you should definitely read. So we're gonna read it for our book club, which brings us to June, which is June on the Range, of course. A reading event, my own reading event, where we celebrate Western fiction, and this is The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey. Can't have a June on the Range, I don't think, without reading some Zane Grey. And this particular book is one of his better-known books, I believe, and it is in the public domain. You can get it for free. There you go. The Lone Star Ranger by Zane Grey. So this is... I don't think I've ever read this. I've read a version of this. There was another version of this that was put out by Leisure Books that I read. And so this was the version that was originally published. This was the original book publication version of this. So that should be cool. That should be cool for June on the Range. And then that brings us to July, and this is a book I've pretty much wanted to read my whole life. I don't know, maybe you want to read it too. This is The Last Man by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, who wrote one of my very favorite books, who wrote one of the greatest books, Frankenstein, Mary Shelley wrote, but she also wrote this book, The Last Man, about the last man after a catastrophe has taken place. I believe it was disease, but you know what? I've never read the book, so I'm not entirely sure. This is probably her best-known work outside of Frankenstein, I believe. But again, a book not many people seem to have read, so we're going to read it for Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. That'll be fun, which brings us to August. August, which is Garb August. And during Garb August, we're going to read Gladiator by Philip Wiley, which really isn't all that trashy, I don't think, but it has had some pretty trashy covers over the years. This is actually a very influential book. This actually influenced the creation of Superman, according to many. A very old book from the 30s, I believe. Of course, I should have looked up when this was written. Oh well. But it definitely did have an influence, probably. I shouldn't say definitely. It probably had an influence on the creation of Superman and other superheroes, because it is about a guy who develops superpowers. And it should be a very interesting read for our book club, the Roger's Cheap Old Book Club, which brings us to September. Now, this is a book I really want to read. This is The Exploits of Brigadier Gerard by Arthur Conan Doyle. Now, I've read some of these stories in different anthologies, but I've never read a whole collection of Brigadier Gerard. Of course, Arthur Conan Doyle more famously created Sherlock Holmes, but this was another one of his more popular characters who seems to have slipped out of the public consciousness. And like a lot of Arthur Conan Doyle's work, has kind of been set aside and forgotten, but we are going to read it and, we'll see how it is. The stories I have read starring this character have been pretty darn good. So I have high hopes for this book. Which brings us to October. October. This is a surefire hit for October. This is Ghost Stories of an Antiquary by M.R. James. M.R. James, the guy that wrote about the creepiest ghosts around. M.R. James, the classic ghost story writer. And since it's going to be October, and we're all going to be reading creepy stuff anyway, why not read about some of the creepiest ghosts with this great book? This was M.R. James' first collection of ghost stories, I think. And so it should be great to read, very appropriate for the time of year when we will be reading it. And it's free, so that's awesome. Which brings us to November, and a science fiction classic, and one of the few books by H.G. Wells I haven't read. It's When the Sleeper Wakes. When the Sleeper Wakes. Now, there were actually two versions of this. This is the earlier version that we are going to be reading. I never really trust when an author or a creator revises a work from when they were younger. It's, when they George Lucas their work, that usually doesn't turn out for the best. So I think, the original version should work, and Roger agrees. We both decided we would read the earlier version, When the Sleeper Wakes by H.G. Wells. So that's cool, an H.G. Wells book I've never read, which is unusual. Which brings us to the end of the year, December, a book I've wanted to read for a long, long time. This is No Name by Wilkie Collins, which is going to be the final book of 2023 for our Cheap Old Book Club. Like I said, every book is free, and this is supposed to be one of Wilkie Collins' better books. And I've really enjoyed Wilkie Collins' better books that I've read. I've really enjoyed The Moonstone. I liked, The Woman in White is one of my very favorite books of all time. So yeah, I'm looking forward to No Name. That should be a great way to close out the year. So we are going to do it. We're going to see how the book club goes, Sometimes BookTube book clubs go down in flames, but I'm pretty sure that even if no one reads these books except me and Roger, we'll just keep doing it. Because, we're that way. So yeah, Roger's Cheap Old Book Club. Join us. And, download some free books and read along with us. Okay, guys, I will see you next time.